everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a discussion about when is the right time to do a neuropsych. My name is Jennifer Volpe. I am a speech language pathologist, and I am co-owner at Speak, Learn, and Play. For those of you who are unfamiliar with us, Speak, Learn, and Play is a multidisciplinary practice located in Brooklyn, New York. We host monthly free webinars really geared towards parents in a sort of ask us anything format where we want you to come with your questions. And we really strive to be a resource for the community. Today, I am joined by my colleague and social worker extraordinaire, Amy Weber. She's also a co-owner of Speak, Learn, and Play. And our guest of honor, Dr. Pio Andreotti, who's a neuropsychologist and my go-to neuropsychologist and just an all-around great person and a great resource, and just is so knowledgeable about not only the neuropsych process, but also what happens next once you have this report and then, you're dealing with the school system. So yeah, let's get started.
If you have questions, because I really want to make sure that we get to all of the parents and all of the therapists' questions. So if you have questions, just you can use your little raise hand emoji or just put them in the chat and we will get to them. To start, I thought I would ask Pio, what is a neuropsychological evaluation and how do you decide when the timing is right for that?
Thank you, everybody. So a neuropsychological evaluation is an assessment of brain behavior relationships. So essentially what we try to look for is how the brain is processing information and then acting on the world. So that means we will look at a number of different areas. We will look at cognitive functioning. So there's IQ testing. Mostly because we're talking about children, we'll look at academic achievement. So we'll look at their reading, writing, and math skills in a variety of different ways. And then we look at all the underlying skills that would affect that. So language processing, visual spatial skills, memory, and executive function. The executive functions usually things like attention, problem solving, planning, organizing. And then we also try to get information from parents and teachers regarding the child's behavior and their environment. So there'll be rating scales and interviews regarding the child's ability to focus, participate, how they keep track of their belongings, how they transition. And then we compile that together into a report. And then we use that information to try to decide, what the next best step would be, or the next most appropriate step would be, I should say, in order to identify, how we can help the individual student. In terms of when, it's really when the time is right, is really when you feel the child needs it. So I've worked with children as young as preschool age when there's apparent delays. I work with children who are as old as high school age, where their resources have kind of carried them through and then they've hit the wall. And then what they used to do is no longer effective because the expectations have jumped. And now there's more that they're planning on doing, and what they used to do just doesn't work anymore. So it's run the gamut really in terms of when it happens. It's really when the child starts to show challenges and when you feel it's right to investigate.
And what is the difference between what you do versus like a school evaluation?
Sure. So usually in the schools, work's completed by school psychologists, and they'll do what they call a psychoeducational evaluation. And that's a much shorter version of what we do. So there's always a social history. Usually you'll sit with the social worker first or the psychologist to go over background information. We will both do IQ testing, which is part of both evaluations. And then we'll both do academic testing. So reading, writing, and math measures. And usually the school psychologists do some kind of behavior measure, and that's usually rating scales given to the teachers. They don't always give them to parents, though they should. I mean, that really helps get information. And that's where the psychoeducational evaluation stops. We go beyond that. So we'll look at underlying language processing. We'll look at visual spatial skills. We'll look at memory. And again, the executive function testing, which is not done in the school system.
When would you say or suggest that parents consider just doing a school evaluation versus doing a full neuropsychological evaluation?
Sure. So I think part of it has to do with whether they feel the school is being receptive to their students, to their child's needs. And there are some times where it's very, very obvious that a child is having a challenge. The child's having a reading challenge, and everyone's agreeing that there's a reading challenge going on. You can ask the DOE to do a psychoeducational evaluation. If you agree with the results, and if the results, support the need for the child getting help, you might not need to go any farther than that. If it's a more complex issue, if it's something that seems to be really elusive, if it's something that doesn't show any kind of consistency, or if you don't agree with the evaluation that the Department of Education has completed, then it's probably the right time to do a more involved assessment, which would be a neuropsych evaluation.
Besides, I know that for me, I often recommend a neuropsych evaluation when kids are struggling in school. That's usually, like, let's get started with school. And if they're struggling in pre-K, then like, yeah, let's do it to prepare for kindergarten. And then usually the next kind of struggle point is like second, third grade, and then the transition to middle
Middle
school,
school
and
and
then
high
the
school one,
transition
yep.
to high school. Are there other reasons that you would suggest doing a neuropsych evaluation besides just the kid is struggling in school?
Yes. So sometimes children will do okay in school, but you'll see struggles at home. So when they're coming home, a lot of times kids will use something we call masking to do their best to work in the classroom. But by the time they get home, they're probably exhausted and they can't keep that mask up anymore. So the struggle to do homework, the struggle to keep things organized, the struggle to find things in the house, the struggle to socialize and get along with other children. I think a big piece of testing that goes unobserved or kind of underestimated is the social aspect of it, because a lot of the times, socialization is so important in the classroom, but it's not so easy to test for under the circumstances that school does. So, for autism testing, which is one of my big referrals, if the schools don't always handle that very easily or efficiently. So privately we'll do the full battery of assessment to see where the child's skill level is and do additional autism testing on top of that to determine if there's a social pragmatic issue, if it truly is autism, and then what kinds of supports would then benefit the student at that point.
I think that social piece is so important because a lot of kids, like, you will ask the teachers, does my kid have friends? And the teachers are like, yeah, definitely. Everybody loves your kid. But you're not getting asked for play dates and you're not getting asked to birthday parties. And,
Mhm.
you reach out to somebody and say, hey, do you want to come to my house? And they never really respond. So, or you ask your kid, who are you sitting with at lunch? Or who do you play with at recess? And there's no real answer.
I
So
just did an observation on a student not so long ago where everyone in the school is saying he has friends, and the parents like he doesn't. So when I observed him, he played next to kids or he played in the same group, but not with them. It was the same activity, but not necessarily part of the group. So yeah, I think, like I said, casually it can go missed. But when you really start looking at what's going on, how they're interacting, how often they're interacting, you see this stuff starts to pop out. And that's why, when we do classroom observations, we try to decide when's the best time. Is it the subject that's the challenge? If it's socializing, recess is probably the best time to do it because then you can see whether or not they actually socialize. So I always try to change the timing of it or change the class that I observe depending on whatever the need is.
what does a neuropsych evaluation entail? Like, you talked a little bit about the types of testing you'll do. Is there, like, how many days? What are the logistics of it?
So the way I usually conduct the testing is the first meeting is with the parents without the child present. And that's really just going over history, everything from birth until that day. If the child's been previously evaluated, I ask to see the previous evaluations. It's of no harm to your child for us to see them. It actually is helpful because then we can see developmental trends. And the testing itself is usually broken up over a few days. I try to emulate a school day as much as possible. So we'll start at 9 and end at around 2-ish with a lunch break in the middle. And this way, you get to see how the child responds in the morning and in the afternoon. For some children, that's too long of a day, especially for the really young ones. Yeah. So sometimes we'll end early and then we'll pick up another day to make up the time. Usually it's anywhere between 6 to 8 hours of assessment and that's direct assessment and observation. And then once all that's done, once the report's generated, which usually takes a few weeks because there's a lot of information, then we meet again with the parents to have a feedback session. And then that kind of sparks the next stage of what happens, whether it's meeting with the schools, meeting with the attorneys, in that point. So
We just got a message or a question through the chat. A child currently in kindergarten in the NEST program. What would you recommend for a student who has received an educational diagnosis of autism? The parent is wanting to make sure there are no underlying issues.
So I guess the question is, how are they doing in school? Because if they're functioning appropriately within the program they're in, you may not need to do anything. If the child is still struggling with learning, if the child is struggling with interacting, if you feel the class setting is too big and they're not tolerating the setting they're in or the supports they're receiving aren't enough, then it might be the time to do an evaluation. It really depends on whether or not you feel your child is functioning in the class setting and whether they're able to make progress in that setting. And if they are, I wouldn't recommend doing anything because that's the most appropriate place for them. But if you feel they're not and you want more information, then that's probably the time to do an evaluation.
So I so a lot of times, right, I guess when I have parents call me for a speech and language evaluation, and it seems like it might be a little broad, but they're not sure where to start. What would be, when would you recommend, say, just the focus speech and language evaluation versus like a neuropsych evaluation, or even the same thing for OT or any of the other, sort of areas where you can get these focused evaluations?
So if it really looks like it's a focal issue, like if it's really just a language assessment, and you could just do the language assessment. As a matter of fact, a lot of times when I work with students, because of the weight, involved in getting to us sometimes, because we often do have long wait lists because of just how time involved it is. I'll recommend a student seeing a speech therapist for an evaluation or an OT for an evaluation to see if there's something there. And if there is something there, then we can talk about whether, is it affecting them academically? So is it just a language processing issue or is it affecting their reading and writing as well? And if it is, then we need to do more investigation and, kind of dig in to see where that's affecting the student and what more we can do to help them. And that's where a big part of the evaluation comes from. I do a lot of my own testing. I know there are a lot of people who use testing technicians, but I do all my own testing. So, because I like to see the process the child uses to get to the endpoint. And a lot of times, what I will tell the students is, it doesn't really matter to me if you get it right or wrong. I just want to see how you get it done. Because this way, then I can figure out what would be the most appropriate resource to help the student in this situation. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of times I'll recommend a focused assessment, and sometimes I'll just do focal like attention issues. Like the child's functioning okay, and if they're reading, writing, and math is fine by all other accounts, but they just can't get their homework in. Sometimes we'll just do a focused ADHD assessment to see if that's what's going on, and then we can try to approach the school to see if they'll give supports and resources. I do have to say, in order to get help from the school system, you at least have to have, at a minimum, a psychoeducational evaluation. There has to be IQ testing and academics done. So even if we do a focused attention test, that might not be enough for the school to recognize they need help. So whether you do it through a neuropsychologist privately or through the school system, that piece does have to be completed.
No, that makes sense. I think we have some more questions in the chat. Yep.
Yes. Which learning disabilities or issues can the DOE evaluation find versus a private neuropsychological exam? I had a hard time figuring out exactly what DOE evaluation would test for and or find from the coordinator at my child's school.
So that's a great question. I think a lot of what we do is kind of do a deeper dive into the individual skills. So there are some times where a child seems to be reading appropriately, but what a lot of them have done is memorized some of the words from the word list and they're doing sight reading as opposed to actual reading, or they're doing memorization as opposed to actual reading. So we try to look to see whether this phonological processing challenge is going on. Now, if a child can read real words, but not fake words, which isn't often assessed for at the school level, that means that when they encounter new words they've never seen before, it's going to be a struggle. They might eventually get it, but it's going to be extra work for them. It's going to be much more laborious for them, in which case it might be aversive for them. And they might decide to just stop reading altogether, which I've seen happen before. So there are some situations where the DOE kind of does like a light overview of what's going on, and we'll kind of dig deeper, try to find the underlying challenges. There are a lot of times where kids seem to be reading fine and their phonological process is okay, but they're still not able to read fluently. And that's where we do the executive function testing, because then it might be an attention or a retrieval related issue, which is not something the DOE tests for. So they can read words just fine, but they can't read paragraphs. That's where we start seeing the executive function challenges start to pop up because they're not reading fluently. It's either taking them a really long time or they're doing a lot of whole word guessing or just assumptions. So that's a different kind of intervention than, say, in Orton Gillingham, which you just focus on the phonics of it. It's not focusing on the fluency piece. So we kind of have to change that around depending on what that information reveals.
Yeah. And I think with that, and maybe, the DOE has what, like 7 classifications. So is that what they would diagnose in terms of a psychoed? Or, I mean, do you get clear diagnoses with, sort of like a neuropsychological evaluation?
So we can actually diagnose. So the DOE, they're only allowed to provide categories for students, classifications. So, and there's only 13 classifications. So you have to be pigeonholed into one of those 13 classifications in order to get support. We kind of have the ability to be more fine-tuned with what's going on by offering actual diagnoses. So we can say it's a reading disability. So if your child has a reading disability, your classification will be learning disability. If your child has a math disability, the classification will be learning disability. They have to collapse it down. So that's one of the reasons that we can be much more specific because we're allowed to be. They're not allowed to be in the school system.
Yeah. I think we had one hand raised. Kristen, would you like to answer your question? Ask your question?
Yeah. So I have a question. If you get your daughter, I'm looking to get my daughter to get a neuropsych evaluation. She is 7. My question is, once you identify the skills or the competencies that she needs to work on, or whatever the diagnosis is, as you described, Amy, the different milestones, so whether that's going to the next grade, whether that's going to middle school, whether it's going to high school, do you get additional psych evals during that time period? Does time, age, maturity change at the point of 7 today versus when she's going to be in high school? So I have a question in just terms of time and how you measure their progress.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. A lot of the materials we use are broken down into age. So there are some tests we use that only are applicable for kids 3 to 5. And from 6 to 11, we have to use a different measure. So yes, time and age is an important factor for us to figure out because we want to know that we're using the right material for the right age range. The way testing works is we compare children to other kids in their age range. And that's how we figure out developmental trends, right? Are they functioning the same way other kids in their age range are? The same thing with class. Are they functioning at the same level that other kids in their grade are? In terms of, how often to do the evaluation is considered good or valid for about 3 years. After that, we have to decide whether a new evaluation is necessary, at least a new neuropsychological evaluation is necessary, or if the school can do enough testing to support it on their own. And that's really up to you as a parent to whether or not you feel the school can do that, or whether you want to get another private evaluation completed in order to kind of get a sense of where all those additional skills are. As long as it will provide your child with the support they need, that's really how you make the decision. Again, if you see the school evaluation and it just doesn't provide enough information, or they decided based on what their findings are, they're going to discontinue services, and you still feel strongly that the child needs services, it might be worth it then to do a more involved investigation and a more involved assessment. Does that answer your question? I want to make sure I got all the points in there.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay, I have more chat questions. This one is a pretty straightforward, easy one. If the DOE approves a neuropsych for the enhanced rate, can you use someone outside of the DOE list provided and pay the difference?
No, you cannot. If you agree to take the DOE rate, you take the DOE rate. It's kind of like insurance at that point. You can't pay the balance of an insurance bill. You have to actually pay what the bill is. The provider has to take what the insurance company pays. It's the same thing with the DOE. So you're not allowed to pay the difference. If you're being charged the difference, that's a problem. And you should say something to the provider because they're not allowed to charge you above what the DOE offers.
Based on the evaluation and recommendations, will your team make recommendations for an attorney if needed? At times, finding a strong team to support your child becomes extremely complicated.
Yes. I mean, there's a number of attorneys I've worked with. So I always provide parents, if they choose to pursue, legal proceedings, I'll always provide parents with a list of attorneys they can contact, attorneys and advocates. I ask them to choose who they feel comfortable with, because they're the person who's going to be fighting for you. And I'm happy to work with whomever you work with. So, I mean, even if there's people who are not on the list that I haven't worked with before, I'm happy to interact with them, because my role in this is to make sure that my evaluation is then used to get the child support. So usually what I do is I'll attend IEP meetings to make sure that my report is appropriately interpreted, and share my results with the school. And I testify in hearings all the time. I testified this morning, actually. So just to get a sense of, to make sure that the child's rights are being appropriately managed, and that their access to their education is appropriate as well.
We did not mention in our introduction, but Pio is a walking encyclopedia of DOE regulations. I have heard him ask in IEP meetings and in other school meetings, like, what page would you find that recommendation or that regulation on? And they can't find it. So yeah,
Schools come up with stuff all the time that make no sense. I mean, from some of our meetings, they were asking for documents to be signed that had nothing to do with the nature of the meeting. So there's, a rule called FERPA, which is about sharing educational documentation. There was no educational documentation shared during the meeting, but the school was requesting. I'm like, this has got nothing to do with what we're doing. Yeah. So my background is in my doctorate's in school community psychology, which is, again, school psychology, but also about sharing psychology with the world and about prevention strategies. And then I have postdocs in clinical neuropsychology and in applied behavior analysis. So I've kind of run the gamut with a lot of the different resources and policies that the DOE has. Some of the interpretations in the meetings are actually, pretty funny after the facts, because it's like, this has nothing to do with anything related to education.
This is a tough question. Why do you see so many kids diagnosed with ADHD when they have many autistic traits and receive many of the same services? And then later you see the child diagnosed with autism later on.
That's a great question. We talk about diagnoses as if they have hard boundaries between them. This is ASD, this is autism, this is ADHD, this is a learning disability. But the reality is diagnoses have a lot of fuzzy barriers. So there's a lot of crossover. If a child's kind of has like tenuous ASD symptoms, or they're not really super clear, a lot of us will not jump to call the child autistic right away, because, we try to focus on the least restrictive environment or the least restrictive diagnosis to support the child's needs. So a lot of times we'll say the child might be ADHD with a social pragmatic component, because that's really what it looks like, because they don't meet full criteria for autism. They don't have the repetitive behaviors. They don't have the sensory behavior. They don't have the unusual restrictive preoccupations. If that's not really there, or it's not really apparent at the time of the assessment, we can't really give the diagnosis. So we'll give like related diagnoses, to try to make sure the child's at least receiving as much support as possible. And then later on, when those behaviors become much more apparent, or the child is less able to mask them or hide them, then we can say, okay, this is really what the diagnosis is. That's really the reason why. I mean, there's a lot of times that we try to be as clear as possible, but the behaviors we're seeing aren't always so clear, or the data we're receiving isn't always so clear. So we have to kind of make the best with what we have, and try to make sure that we hit the most appropriate points when we're offering a diagnosis to get the child support.
Another question just popped up. My child is 4 years old and is up for reevaluation as he is getting ready to enter kindergarten. I believe my child might have several things going on, but the DOE only has classifications. I want to go into this meeting fully prepared. What should I expect at the meeting?
So that's a great question. Without knowing more specifics, I think what parents often need to remember is your voice is as loud as theirs. So your voice carries equal weight in terms of your child's needs. Ultimately, they make the decision, but that doesn't mean you have no recourse at that point. So one of the things I'd expect, especially from a turning five meeting, is you're meeting with a bunch of people who've never met your child before. Some of them may have done an observation, but very rarely do they do turning five testing anymore. Very rarely does the team actually go and do any kind of assessment. Usually they just get reports from the preschool your child is in or from whoever your CPSE provider is if they're not in a specialized preschool. And you can say, I don't feel that this reflects my child's needs. I feel that this might be underestimating or overestimating what my child can do. I think in the one-to-one situation of the testing, they did really well, but in the classroom, that's not what's going on, or I don't see those kinds of supports at home. So you're allowed to say all that stuff. You're allowed to bring with you whomever you want to an IEP meeting. So if you feel like you want to bring an advocate with you, or even just a friend to provide support for you, you can certainly do that if it would make you feel more comfortable. Most of the Turning 5 meetings I've been to have not been contentious. I mean, usually they're just kind of trying to get the child into the next level. What you should know is the resources that exist for preschool do not exist at the school age level. So a lot of kids who get to see it at the preschool level, which is that one-to-one teaching, that doesn't exist at the school age level. They transition that into what they call SETS, special ed teacher support services, which is what we used to call resource room, which is a pull-out service, and the child's in a small group. So, I mean, that's one thing to keep in mind. If you wanted to maintain see-it support for your child, that would likely involve a lawsuit. I mean, you'd have to sue the DOE to provide that service. You know, the classification. So some of the classes of like classes of 8, which is at the preschool level for children who have, pretty significant or pretty involved language and developmental needs, that doesn't exist at the DOE level. Usually they put them in classes of 10 or 12, which is very, very different. Classes of 12 at the preschool level, usually those kids transition to integrated classes at the CPSE level. So I should say I worked in the CPSE preschool for about 8 years, and I did a lot of the evaluations and the initial evaluations and the Turning 5 meetings. So I've been involved in a lot of these meetings. Like I said, most of the time they're not contentious, but there are a lot of times that parents feel like they've been kind of like given kind of like shorted on supports, because the amount of support they can give at a preschool, it doesn't always exist at the school age level, not without you guys going and arguing for more. And that usually involves getting an evaluation done. Does that answer the question? I want to make sure that answers the question appropriately.
Yes.
Okay.
So I actually have a question, and this has come up. I mean, Pio knows, I think anyone who's familiar with our webinar knows that, my son also has an IEP. It's gone through the process. We've done the Turning Fives. I have had that experience where we sort of fell a little shortchanged, and I know what to expect and I know what to ask for. But a lot of times I think, and I'm asking, the teachers can't flat out say, you need to get your child evaluated. What messages or what maybe should you be listening for, what the teacher is saying that will sort of lead you on that track? Like, what are they sort of saying without really saying that warrants a call to you?
That's a great question. So things like, I'm not quite sure how to help them with this, or I've never encountered something like this before, or if I feel like he's requires a lot of support more than other kids in the class, or things like sometimes they'll flat out say this is not the right place, or my class isn't the right class for them. So you'll sometimes get it, but listen for those messages about how they're different from the other students in the classroom. If you're hearing that kind of language, that means it's probably something you need to investigate more on your own.
Are there other questions? Janet, yes.
Hi, this question might not necessarily pertain to a neuropsych, but being that you've been in the space for as long as you have and have worked with students in different, populations of schools, in your experience, because I have Lucas, who I kind of feel is an in-betweener when it comes to all these assessments and trying to figure out what's the best space for him. From the schools that you have, visited or witnessed, what is the big differences between, let's say, District 75 schools and some of these private or pay schools that are extremely expensive, or these state-approved schools? Because this process can become really confusing. And I think sometimes trying to narrow it down to figure out what is the appropriate fit for your child makes it more difficult.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. District 75, the citywide program, usually deals with kids with more complicated or involved needs. So students who have a lot of needs, who can't really tolerate being in a community setting, would need to be in a specialized setting within a school and within the DOE system. They work with children with, significant developmental needs, learning disabilities, physical disabilities, but they don't use certain methodologies that some children may benefit from. So, for example, D75 does not provide ABA support, so applied behavior analysis. So, if you have a child who's on the spectrum who really needs ABA and they're in a DOE class, they might not be getting enough of that ABA support, in which case you'd have to find another school that does provide that support. And that would involve, again, getting an outside evaluation. The same thing with learning challenges. If your child is cognitively appropriate or cognitively high functioning, but demonstrating significant learning disabilities, the DOE doesn't really have a place for those kids. They don't really have a way to treat really high functioning kids with the really significant learning challenges. And I've worked with, fourth, fifth, sixth graders who have like first grade reading levels. And there's nowhere in the DOE system for there to go because they're not designed to really help kids at that level. So that's when you need to do an outside evaluation or look for an outside school to provide the supports. So that it's a tricky question because the intent of D75 is to support these students, but there are limitations in their system because they have to, again, kind of squeeze as many kids as they can into those classes.
Somebody asked, will I be able to get an IEE? I'm assuming they mean IEP. If the DOE evaluation was not thorough, what does parent need to say or do to get the IEP after the psychoeducation?
Well, the IE is actually an evaluation.
Independent evaluation.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So you can just ask for it. You're allowed to ask for an IEE if you disagree with the school's position. They're supposed to give it to you. They don't always. Usually it has to go up the chain and get approved through supervisors. Depending on whom you ask, that's kind of what happens. But you are entitled to an IEE if you disagree with the school's position. That is one of your rights as a parent. You say, I disagree with you. I think you did not capture my child's needs, and I want an independent evaluation, in order to really reassess, in order to reassess my child's needs.
And I actually know a little bit about that because I sometimes do IEEs, but also that list is also limited in terms of
Very limited,
who you go
yes.
because yes, very limited, not because there aren't people who want to help, but because even with these IEEs, the DOE still like vets these people and then has them sign up for a list. And then there's payment issues. So there are a lot of people who aren't on them. And I think what my families have done is often gotten an advocate who will fight for you to get an IEE, but they can get approval for someone like Pio, like me for a speech evaluation at that provider's rate. And it takes a while, but I've never seen that though happen without an advocate.
Yeah, usually to get the DOE has a very limited rate, which I know a lot of providers can't function under. And honestly, personally, I've waited up to 2 years for DOE payments to come through, which I know a lot of providers aren't willing to wait for. I mean, it is what it is. I have no problem doing them. A lot of the times, parents will start an impartial hearing process and request an evaluation that way. And then request a suite of evaluations, neuropsych evaluations, speech evaluations, OT evaluations, and then they'll ask for it at the provider specific rate. And that has occurred with a lot of the cases I've worked with as well.
I see we have a hand. Do you want to?
Yeah, thank you. So this is really great and helpful. And I've attended a few kind of talk like this before, but I feel like I'm still stuck at the very first stage, which is what is the right eval to get, right? My kid is high functioning, so that I'm very fortunate with, but there are definite like issues, like the books that I've read and coming to talks like these and hearing like some of what, other parents are dealing with. I'm like, yep, I do that every day. So I just can't figure out what's the right, do I go for a full blown neuropsych? Do I get, we've already had speech and, the kid does get speech therapy, but where is there like a list, like a breakdown, like just some very super basic resource of where to start with it?
I don't think so, but I think it's a great idea. I think when we talk about when we early, we talked about when's the right time
Yeah.
for more involved evaluation. I think if your child's been receiving services and you don't feel that they're making appropriate progress, it might be the right time. If your conversations with whoever the provider is or the progress reports you're receiving isn't showing the progress that you thought they would be having, or if they're feeling stuck and not able to make any gains, or they're not finding a way to move forward, that might be the right time for a more involved evaluation. So yeah, I mean, those are definitely some questions that I get asked from parents a lot. Should I pursue this now? And I always tell them, if you feel that you're not seeing the gains, or they're telling you they're not making the gains that they anticipated, the providers are telling you their child's not making the gains they anticipated they would be making, it might be the right time to dig a little deeper, and get some more answers that way.
Okay. That
But I think that heuristic is a great idea. I mean, let's put something together.
yeah, that is helpful. Thank you for that.
I was just thinking we should get like a flow chart. Maybe that's
Yeah,
something to work
right,
on.
right.
And if we do
Oh
it,
my
gosh.
gosh. Yes.
Absolutely.
It's
I'm
not,
writing a note.
it doesn't, it doesn't have to be gospel, but certainly the difference between like a full-blown neuropsych or just a focus assessment is because those cost very different amounts.
Yes.
So,
And I'll always tell parents, if you're not quite sure, start with the school. Have the school do an evaluation, see what they say. If that doesn't give you the answer you're looking for, then it's time to investigate more. Because at least the school doesn't give I mean, it's time involved for your child, but it's not a huge investment of money, right? Because the school does an evaluation for free. If at that point you're not seeing the information you hope to see, or what they're showing doesn't match what you see your child doing, then it's okay to say maybe we need to do more testing at that point and do a more involved evaluation.
right. Okay. Very, very helpful. I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Kristen, you have another question? Please.
Yeah, Jen, I think you already kind of have that map. You kind of helped me with that mapping, just FYI.
In my head, it's there. It's just like,
Just put it on paper. But the one thing I do have is I always am a big believer is once you identify the problem, you assign the right solution to the problem. Just like Dr. Pio, if you could help me understand, like, where are the success measures? Like after you receive this information, I'm a big believer of like information will help me us get where. And so Jen, you've helped me out a lot of like, okay, what's the school going to do? I will be honest, I'm in private school. So there, if interesting, less resources specifically to helping my child every single day that many people may experience differently. So for me, it's certainly being the advocate in my environment for my child. So I'm really curious in terms of like, once we understand it, how do you know you're on the right track? Like, what are the success markers? And more specifically, I'll tell you, I believe my daughter, or I think she's showing signs of a little bit ADD or ADHD. So I'm very curious on like, what are those success measures after you receive the diagnosis?
So that's a great question. I think one of the biggest success measures is their achievement in school. Are you seeing their grades going up? Are you seeing them less frustrated doing the work? Are you seeing them more, showing better strategies when they're approaching a task? And the one thing to remember is this timeline isn't consistent with every child. So some children will take to the intervention immediately, and you'll see a huge shift. Other children, not so much. And it takes them a little while longer to kind of build those foundational strategies they need in order to get to the same place some of their peers are getting to. So I mean, that's what we try to look for. I mean, the immediate thing we look for is whether there's a reduction in resistance to the work, because it means they feel more comfortable doing what it is we're asking them to do, which means they feel supported, which means they feel like they're being heard. And you've kind of broken through that wall now of resistance that a lot of LD kids pop up because they don't want to feel like they can't do something. So we try to look for that piece of it. And then we start looking at the actual testing. So one of the reasons that you'll do repeated testing is to see whether they've made progress in those domains. Are they keeping pace with their peers? Are they kind of gradually pushing more towards that average expected range that we're hoping for? I mean, you have to understand that when someone has a learning disability, for them to kind of get to that average range, they have to do twice as much work as somebody who doesn't have a learning disability. So there's a lot of effort and labor on their part to get there. So we try to see, are they kind of trending closer to that line? And we have to also anticipate that this might be something that's a challenge for them for a very, very long time, in which case, can we teach them better strategies to use to kind of get around whatever the problem is? So if the problem is, strictly phonics and they're not getting the phonics concepts, what can we do to kind of go around that and help them to read better anyway? What other resources can we provide them, whether it's, audiobooks, whether it's using other kinds of reading strategies? Jen can tell you all about the various reading strategies that you could do as well. Try to figure out, ways around those kinds of difficulties. And if you see them using the strategies more and more consistently, then they're making progress. I mean, that's really what it is. It's really individualized per student, but that's kind of one of the ways that we mark, how a child is progressing.
Great. Thank you.
Sure.
We had a question. A child currently gets 12 months support on his IEP. Can he still get that when he goes into kindergarten?
So no, unless your child is going to a District 75 program, they're likely only going to get 10 months of support. There are some, it depends. And so it really, I guess my question would be, what class size is your child coming from and going into? Because at the preschool level, we have to request 12-month support, but don't think I've ever gotten a refusal from a CPSC administrator for 12 months if the child needed it. We usually wrote a justification asking for the additional 6 weeks of help. At the school age level, schools are closed for those months. The only schools that are open are the D75 programs. If you're looking to get the therapeutic support over the summer, if your child just needs related services, I don't think that's something the school gives either, not without an impartial hearing. So you're not going to get that either. That's what I mean. A lot of times the parents feel shorted when they go to the school system, because all of the support and attention they got at preschool just vanishes when you go to CSE, because they just don't exist. So you'd have to either sue for it or go into a specialized program that has it. I should say, though, a lot of the private special ed schools also are not 12 months. So even if you're looking to go into a private placement, a lot of those schools are 10-month schools as well. Some of them may have summer camps, but it's not the same thing as having 12-month school years.
This is a question. My first grader is making a lot of progress with reading, according to her AIS coach, who helps her with reading a few times a week in a small group during the school day. At the same time, with all of this help, she's still below grade level and not reading completely fluently. And when this parent asks the coach if she thinks there's something else going on with her daughter that we need to evaluate, she just shrugs and says she's not an expert. She doesn't want her to fall behind and miss a learning disability, but also doesn't want to subject her daughter to an evaluation if it's not necessary.
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, if you're not quite sure, start with the school. Ask for for a school evaluation to be completed. If that doesn't give you the answer you're looking for, then it's probably time to do a neuropsych evaluation. If you feel the school, one of the other reasons parents will sometimes come and do evaluations is if they feel the school is just not being supportive enough and they feel it's just not the right environment. In which case, you might want to bypass the school and just do a neuropsych eval. But that's up to you. I mean, if you feel that they haven't been amenable or haven't been flexible or haven't been listening, then you might want to go outside of the system. But if you think that you just want to kind of start to investigate, a school evaluation is okay to start with. And then we can always do more assessment afterwards.
Once a recommendation is made, for example, one-to-one speech, would it be appropriate to assume that setting in time, for example, 45 minutes versus 30 minutes, is typically fit for at least 1 to 2 years? The school is pushing for shorter sessions, push-in, and group sessions, but it hasn't even been a whole year yet.
They will always push for shorter, fewer sessions. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I always consider when we're recommending the time of a session is transition. How hard is it for the child to transition? Because if you have a 30-minute session, part of it is walking from the classroom, then getting into your office, and then starting the work, you've probably lost about 10 minutes at that point. If the child can't transition, you've lost even more. So, I mean, that's one of the ways we try to figure out, would a 45-minute session be more appropriate? Do they need that extra time to settle in so you can really start doing the work? So yeah, but the schools will always push for shorter sessions and try to bundle you into groups. If you don't feel it's appropriate, you can say that. You can say, I don't feel it's appropriate. I want to maintain the one-to-one. And that's part of the conversation, the negotiation that goes on at the IEP meeting. They cannot make that change if it's not an IEP meeting. They cannot, if the IEP says 45 minutes, they cannot give you 30 minutes without a meeting. You have to approve that. That IEP is a contract, so they have to abide by that contract. If they're not giving you that time, they're not providing your child a free and appropriate public education according to their IEP.
This
And
is
sorry, go ahead. No, I was just going to say, I know there's a lot of chat questions, but just and fight for it if that's what you really think. I mean, again,
Yeah.
I had my son's IEP meeting. They tried really hard to get rid of his sets, but he's still reading behind grade level. I was like, no, no, no. And I just calmly said, I will not, I will not agree to that. And they couldn't change it. So
Yeah.
if that makes you feel any better.
Yeah, you have a say in this. Your voice matches theirs. They're not the only voice in the room. So you're allowed to make your point about what your child's needs are. And there are certain things they can do and certain things they can't do. But if taking away sets is something they want to try to do and you're vehemently against that, you can make that point known and that you do not agree with that. If they do it anyway, then it might be time for an attorney.
This is one that I know you and I have dealt with very recently, Pio. What happens if the school ignores the evaluation recommendations?
That's when you need to see an advocate or an attorney. It's very clear at that point that the school is not going to be a resource and they're not going to be providing your child with what they need. So personally, I don't make recommendations I know the school can't handle. So if I'm not going to ask for 16 sessions of speech a week because it's just not going to happen. It's also going to be horrible for the child to do that. That's a lot of time. But, I always ask for things that I know that can exist within the school system, whether they're a private school or not. But if the school completely ignores the recommendations, even if they're completely reasonable recommendations, it's probably time to see an attorney.
We've one more question. My twins are 10. Autism, speech delay, functional language delays, previously diagnosed speech sound disorder. Language has greatly improved. Conversation skills really emerging. My question, will there be much more language growth? They receive speech in school. I'm debating if more is necessary outside. Our speech provider has said no.
That's a good question. It's hard to predict, beyond what the child is doing now, exactly how far the language growth is going to be. One of the things that we try to, help people keep in mind is these evaluations are a snapshot in time. This is how the child is functioning now under these conditions. And we try to generalize from that. It's kind of hard because it's a specific question. So I have a lot of questions about other stuff related to this. So I would say if you don't believe the provider and you want to get a second opinion, you can. That's always okay to do. If you feel your child can tolerate additional speech sessions outside of school, you can do that. Just know the DOE is probably not going to support that and you'd have to pay for it privately. That's the only caveat to that. To get any service outside of the school, if the DOE offers it, you'd either have to pay for it yourself or sue for it. Then you have to balance out into which you feel is most appropriate. If you want to talk about increasing services at the next IEP meeting, you can certainly do that too. Usually children with ASD are entitled to at least 5 sessions a week of speech therapy, according to federal law. So you can ask for more if you feel it's necessary. I would think, though, in this situation, you probably want to ask for group sessions because groups of kids are how we work on conversational skills. That's how we work on socialization. So this is one situation where I'd say, yeah, I think a group session would be really appropriate because that's how we work on socializing. They're going to chat with other kids, especially if they're engaged in something they both enjoy doing. But yeah, I have a lot. It's kind of a specific question, so I have a lot of questions kind of going into it. So I'm happy to talk more if you have any questions afterwards. But
I'm sorry, somebody wants to know where they can find that information on 5 times a week.
I'll try to look it up because I'm pretty sure, from my understanding of the federal rules, if you have an autism diagnosis, you're entitled to 5 sessions of speech a week. That's what I've always been told by the attorneys. But I'll certainly try to look that up and see if I can get back to you with that information.
Linda, you have your hand.
So yeah, I have a 7.5-year-old son, and I've been having a hard time trying to navigate this whole process. I guess my son was in. He used to have a SEED back in preschool. He was in a private school where he was supposed to be he was supposed to be getting speech. He had, I guess it's like an IEP, but because we were in a private school, they didn't accommodate it. So this year he's in a public school, and he's getting speech. He's getting OT, and we did a psychoeducational, and I thought that they captured him quite well. He has he has ADHD, maybe something else. I'm definitely not autism kind of stuff, but more like short-term memory issues like that. I'm not sure if there's other diagnosis related to that. But I guess my question is, I've been trying to get a psychoeducational to see what other diagnosis or what other issues he's having. Um, do I go the route of going through the DOE because that's where we're sort of going, or do I try to get, I guess it's like, is it called an IEE, and try to get approval for someone outside the DOE, or is that just a longer process? And should
So
I just go ahead and
before you
the
get, I'm
DOE?
sorry. Yeah, no, I'm sorry. Before you get an IEE, you have to get a psycho ed done. So the school has to do some kind of assessment first.
They've done that. He
They,
has a psycho ed. Yeah.
okay, he does. When was the last time it was done?
I can't hear anything.
So he had a psycho ed done in October or around October time, and they implemented the IEP, and he's not making much progress. And now the school psychologist, I've been asking the whole time, listen, he needs a para, he needs much more supervised, smaller classroom size and a neuropsych. Now, because he's not making progress, they've agreed to give him a neuropsych. They're in the process of, I've asked for an enhanced rate. Again, I don't know, like I'm reading these stuff online, so I'm asking these
You
things,
did the
but
right thing. Yeah.
right.
Hopefully.
But based on what you just said, and I did read these things that, like, obviously they're vetting these people and they're people working for the DOE. Do I just go ahead and take whatever they're giving me at this point, just do a DOE neuro psych, or do I try to go, I guess, is it an IE route? Is
Well,
that
it's the same thing. So the DOE
it's the same
neuropsych
thing?
is an IE. Yeah. So if they're telling you they're willing to pay for a provider outside of their school system to do this. Now they are vetted, they are on a list. It's a very short list, and I know that not a lot of people have availability, but you absolutely should try that way if you have the voucher. So I think at this point it sounds like they're not being really amenable to what you're asking. So getting that outside evaluation done is probably a good idea. If you take the DOE evaluation and you don't agree with it, I don't believe you're allowed to ask for another one without going to a hearing. So whoever you choose, if they provide you with an assessment that you're still not 100% in agreement with, you'd either have to pay for your own assessment or you'd have to sue for another evaluation. But that's a conversation that's where it starts becoming conversations for advocates and attorneys, because that's a very specific kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, it's a good place to start. I mean, if that's where that's where you have, it's absolutely a good place to start. And then, if you do need more, we can talk about, what to do after that.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
We had somebody asked about speaking afterwards, and I think that would be a great place to wrap up. Pio, if people have more questions, if they want to reach you, how can they reach you?
Sure. I'm going to put my website is pioandreotti.com. You can also reach me on my office number 314-635-0230. So I'll put that in the chat as well. And my email address is pioandreotti@yahoo.com. So I've just put all that in the chat for you guys also.
Did you live in St. Louis? Why do you have a 314 number?
It's a Google number.
We don't have to put.
So during the pandemic, I tried to get a Google number. The only number available was St. Louis. So now when I call people, they think I'm calling about their extended car insurance. No one thinks I'm actually calling from Brooklyn. But yes, I've tried to change it, and been stuck with it. So I'm owning it now. So that's my Google Office number.
Well, sorry, I had technical difficulties. That's why I'm here. We were in the same office. Thank you so much for everybody.
Yes.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
Pio, for joining us.
Oh, this is a lot of fun. I'd love to do this again.
And then if there are other questions too, you can also reach out to us at speaklearnandlightbrooklyn.com, and you can always like us on Instagram, or follow us for more of the webinars and all that good stuff, and sign up for our mailing list. So yeah, we look forward to next month. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.